February 25, 1945. 7 miles above Tokyo, Second Lieutenant Robert Chen pressed his face against the rubber eyepiece of his AN/APQ-13 radar scope, watching green phosphorescent returns paint across the cathode ray tube in his darkened station aboard a B-29 superfortress. Below him, stretching for 15,000 feet in every direction, solid cloud cover concealed the entire Japanese capital. He could not see the city, could not see the aiming points his bombardier training had prepared him to identify, could not even see the ground. Yet, in 18 seconds, he would release 2 tons of incendiary bombs onto a target he had never laid eyes on, guided entirely by electronic echoes bouncing off buildings and streets he could only imagine. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The scope showed Tokyo's waterfront as a bright edge where land met water, the Sumida River as a dark snake winding through clusters of returns representing dense urban construction. Chen adjusted the range ring, his gloved hand steady despite the knowledge that everything he had been taught about precision bombardment, visual acquisition, clear identification, pinpoint accuracy had become irrelevant the moment XXI Bomber Command crossed the Japanese coast and found nothing below but an impenetrable grey blanket stretching to every horizon. "This is what the Air Force doesn't tell you," he wrote in his mission log after landing at Saipan 9 hours later. "We're dropping bombs on cities we cannot see, guided by green blips on a screen, trusting that mathematics and radio waves can replace human eyes. They call it radar bombing. We call it flying blind and hoping the technology works. This is not the war we trained for. This is something new, something desperate. And tonight it destroyed 8 square miles of Tokyo through clouds, so thick our lead navigator could not even find the checkpoint islands until his radar painted their coastlines in glowing phosphor." The foundation of American strategic bombing doctrine had been built on a principle that seemed unshakable: daylight precision attacks using visual bombsights against specific industrial and military targets. From 1942 through 44, the United States Army Air Forces had committed thousands of aircraft and tens of thousands of trained aircrew to this doctrine in both Europe and the Pacific. The Norden bombsight, a mechanical marvel weighing 50 pounds and costing $8,000 per unit, represented the pinnacle of visual bombing technology. Its complex system of mirrors, gyroscopes, and mechanical computers could theoretically place a bomb within 100 feet of its aiming point from 20,000 feet altitude under ideal conditions. Bombardiers trained for months to master the device, learning to account for wind, drift, aircraft speed, altitude, and trajectory in split-second calculations. The problem was that ideal conditions rarely existed over Japan. Lieutenant Colonel James Garcia, operations officer for the 73rd Bombardment Wing based on Saipan, filed a weather analysis in December 1944 that should have alarmed every strategic planner in the Pacific. Weather reconnaissance flights over the Japanese home islands conducted throughout November and December, he reported, found the target areas completely obscured by cloud cover on 82% of flying days. On days classified as marginal visibility, high-altitude winds at 25,000 to 30,000 feet regularly exceeded 100 miles per hour, creating the phenomenon meteorologists called the jet stream, though American planners barely understood it. These winds, concentrated in a narrow band at the exact altitude B-29 seconds flew for maximum range and defensive advantage, could accelerate bombs horizontally by 2 miles or more during their 30-second fall, rendering the Norden bombsight's calculations meaningless. The strategic implications were catastrophic. The most expensive weapons system in human history, the B-29 Superfortress program, costing $3.7 billion in 1945 money, had been designed explicitly for precision strategic bombing. Each aircraft cost $1,071,000. Each crew required 18 months of specialized training. The entire doctrine of defeating Japan through air power depended on the ability to destroy specific industrial facilities: railways, steel mills, aircraft factories, oil refineries, the sinews of Japanese war production. But you cannot bomb what you cannot see. In December 1944, XXI Bomber Command flew 9 major strikes against Japanese targets. 7 were classified as ineffective due to weather. 2 missions against the Musashi aircraft engine plant near Tokyo managed to drop bombs approximately near the target area, but post-strike reconnaissance showed less than 2% of bombs landed within the factory boundaries. The remainder fell across residential districts, farmland, and in some cases, into Tokyo Bay, blown off course by winds the bombardiers had not even known existed until their bombs disappeared into the jet stream. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, faced a crisis that threatened not just the strategic bombing campaign, but the entire argument for an independent air force. Arnold had staked his reputation and the future of American air power on the premise that strategic bombing could force enemy surrender without the need for massive ground invasions. The B-29 was supposed to prove that theory against Japan. Instead, by January 1945, after 2 months of operations from the Mariana Islands, XXI Bomber Command had achieved almost nothing of strategic value. Brigadier General Haywood Hansell, commander of XXI Bomber Command, believed passionately in precision bombing doctrine. He had helped write the strategic bombing theory at the Air Corps Tactical School in the 1930s. Every mission he planned focused on specific industrial targets, high-altitude attacks in daylight when possible, using the Norden bombsight as it was designed to be used. When weather prevented visual bombing, Hansell cancelled missions rather than resort to area attacks. His relief from command in January 1945 was inevitable. Arnold needed results, and Hansell's rigid adherence to doctrine was producing none. The replacement arrived at Guam on January 20, 1945. Major General Curtis LeMay, 38 years old, with a face partially paralyzed by Bell's palsy and a reputation for ruthless pragmatism earned commanding B-17 formations over Europe. LeMay spent his first week reviewing mission reports, weather data, and damage assessment, photographs. What he found was a complete disconnect between American bombing theory and Japanese reality. The precision bombing that had worked, albeit imperfectly, against German industrial complexes in the Ruhr Valley faced insurmountable obstacles over Japan. German targets were large, concentrated industrial facilities. Japanese war production was dispersed across thousands of small workshops integrated into residential areas. German weather, while frequently poor, offered occasional windows of clear visibility. Japanese weather was dominated by Pacific storm systems that generated near-constant cloud cover. Most critically, Europe lacked the jet stream phenomenon that made high-altitude bombing over Japan a mathematical impossibility. LeMay's background included something Hansell lacked: experience with radar bombing systems in Europe. During his time with the 8th Air Force, LeMay had worked with early H-2X radar sets, crude devices that could barely distinguish cities from countryside, but could see through clouds when the Norden bombsight saw nothing. He understood that radar was not a supplement to visual bombing. It was an entirely different technology, requiring different tactics, different training, and a willingness to abandon the fiction of precision for the reality of effectiveness. The AN/APQ-13 radar system mounted in B-29 bomb bays represented American electronics at its wartime peak, though few people outside specialized technical circles understood its capabilities or limitations. Developed jointly by Bell Telephone Laboratories, Western Electric, and the MIT Radiation Laboratory, the APQ-13 was an evolution of the British H-2S ground mapping radar, operating at a frequency of 9375 MHz, plus or minus 45 MHz, roughly 10 centimeters wavelength. The system's heart was a rotating parabolic antenna housed in a retractable radome between the bomb bays, scanning a 3-degree cone beneath the aircraft. Radio pulses transmitted from the antenna bounced off ground features and returned as echoes. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this, displayed on a circular cathode ray tube in the radar operator's station. Dense urban areas with many buildings returned strong echoes, appearing bright on the scope. Open water absorbed the pulses, appearing dark. Coastlines showed as sharp, bright lines, where land met sea. Technical Sergeant Walter Morrison, a radar operator with the 497th Bombardment Group, described his introduction to the system during training at Alamogordo, New Mexico in September 1944. The instructor showed us photographs of what Tokyo would look like on the scope, he wrote in a letter to his parents discovered decades later. A kidney-shaped bright mass representing the dense city center, with the Sumida River cutting through as a dark line. Tokyo Bay showing as a large dark area to the east. The instructor told us that if we could identify the coastline and the river, we could bomb Tokyo in any weather, day or night, through any cloud cover. What he didn't tell us was how hard it would be to distinguish one bright return from another, or how to know if that cluster of echoes was an aircraft factory or a residential district. The radar showed us shapes, not targets. Everything else was guesswork and hope. The operational use of radar bombing required coordination between 3 crew members: the radar operator, the bombardier, and the navigator. The radar operator controlled the APQ-13, adjusting range, gain, and antenna tilt to produce the clearest possible image on his scope. He identified landmarks, coastlines, rivers, urban areas, lakes, and called out their positions relative to the aircraft's track. The navigator used this information, along with LORAN long-range navigation system fixes, to determine the aircraft's precise position. The bombardier, trained on the Norden site, had to translate the radar operator's descriptions of electronic and returns into bombing calculations, determining the moment to release based on timing rather than visual acquisition. It was bombing by committee, requiring trust, communication, and acceptance that they were attacking geographic areas rather than specific buildings. The system's limitations were substantial. The 3-degree beam width meant that at 30,000 feet altitude, the radar saw a circle approximately 3,000 feet in diameter. Everything within that circle appeared as a single cluster of returns. An aircraft factory 2 blocks from a hospital looked identical on the scope. The range resolution was approximately 500 feet, meaning 2 buildings less than 500 feet apart merged into one bright return. The radar could see through clouds perfectly. It could not see through the ambiguity of what those returns represented. First Lieutenant David Patterson, navigator aboard the B-29 Pacific Queen, described his first radar-guided bomb run in a combat report filed after a mission against Nagoya on December 22, 1944. Our radar operator, Sergeant Collins, had a clear return of the Nagoya coastline and what appeared to be the urban center. The problem was that Nagoya's urban center covered approximately 12 square miles. Our briefed target was the Mitsubishi Aircraft Engine Works, which occupied maybe 1/10 of a square mile within that urban area. Collins could show me where Nagoya was. He could not show me where the engine works was. We bombed on timing, estimating our ground speed from LORAN fixes, and released when the navigator calculated we were somewhere over the target area. Later reconnaissance showed we'd hit residential districts 3/4 of a mile from the actual factory. This was typical. Everyone was bombing 3/4 of a mile from somewhere. By early February 1945, LeMay faced the reality that precision bombing against Japan was achieving nothing strategically significant. A bombing campaign is not measured by effort or courage, but by results. His B-29 seconds were flying 15-hour missions covering 3,000 miles, facing Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire, losing aircraft and crews, and accomplishing essentially nothing because weather prevented them from hitting their briefed targets with sufficient accuracy to matter. The solution LeMay considered was radical, revolutionary, and would have been unthinkable to American strategic bombing advocates just months earlier. If the B-29 seconds could not bomb precisely, they would bomb areas. If they could not see targets visually, they would see them with radar. If high-altitude bombing put them in the jet stream where winds destroyed accuracy, they would bomb from low altitude where winds were manageable. And if Japanese cities were too dispersed for precision attacks to work, they would burn entire cities using incendiaries, accepting that radar could identify urban areas even if it could, not distinguish factories from homes. The first test of LeMay's new approach came on February 25, 1945. The target was Tokyo, but the mission profile differed dramatically from previous attacks. Instead of attempting to hit specific factories, the bombing plan designated a square mile of urban Tokyo as the aiming area. Instead of high-explosive bombs designed to destroy industrial machinery, the B-29 seconds would carry incendiaries, M69 napalm cluster bombs designed to start uncontrollable fires in the wood and paper construction that dominated Japanese residential districts. Most critically, crews were briefed that radar bombing was not just an emergency backup, it was the primary bombing method. 231 B-29 seconds departed Saipan that morning. 172 reached Tokyo to find exactly what weather reconnaissance had predicted: complete cloud cover at 8,000 feet, extending upward through the bomber's 25,000-foot altitude. Not a single crew member saw Tokyo that day. They saw clouds above them, clouds below them, and on their radar scopes, the ghostly phosphorescent image of a city about to burn. The results stunned even LeMay. Post-strike reconnaissance, conducted 2 days later when weather cleared, showed that approximately 1 square mile of Tokyo had been completely destroyed. 28,000 buildings burned. Japanese fire department records later revealed that multiple fires started by incendiaries had merged into a conflagration that overwhelmed firefighting capabilities. More than 3,000 civilians died. For the first time, a radar-guided bombing mission had achieved strategically significant destruction. More importantly, it proved that radar bombing was not just possible, it could be devastating when properly applied. The lesson was immediate and ominous. Radar allowed strategic bombing to continue, regardless of weather. The clouds that had protected Japanese cities for months, that had rendered the Norden bombsight useless and the precision bombing doctrine impossible, no longer offered any protection at all. Weather had become irrelevant. LeMay began planning the operation that would prove radar bombing's full potential against urban Japan, an attack that would become the single most destructive air raid in human history. The firebombing of Tokyo. The planning sessions for Operation Meeting House began in early March 1945 in the operations room at XXI Bomber Command Headquarters on Guam. LeMay gathered his wing commanders and staff officers to outline tactics that would reverse every principle of strategic bombing doctrine they had learned. The bombers would attack at night when Japanese fighter defenses were weakest. They would fly at 5,000 to 9,000 feet below the jet stream but within range of anti-aircraft fire. They would strip out most defensive armament to carry maximum bomb loads, trusting that darkness and Japanese unpreparedness would provide better protection than guns, and they would bomb entirely by radar, using the AN/APQ-13 to guide them to designated aiming points within Tokyo's most densely populated districts. Colonel Thomas Power, operations officer for the mission, laid out the radar bombing procedure with clinical precision. Lead aircraft in each formation would carry experienced radar operators who had trained extensively on Tokyo's radar signature. These Pathfinder crews would identify the primary aiming point, the intersection of the Sumida River and Tokyo's downtown commercial district, a distinctive radar return where water met dense urban construction. They would drop M47 napalm bombs first, creating fires that would mark the target for following aircraft. The main force, flying individually rather than in formation to maximize the spread of incendiaries, would bomb on radar timing, releasing their M69 cluster bombs at calculated intervals to create a carpet of fire across the target area. The weather forecast for March 9th showed typical Pacific conditions: scattered clouds, light winds at low altitude, temperatures in the 40s. The jet stream was irrelevant at the planned bombing altitude. More critically, intelligence indicated that Japanese night fighter forces were depleted and poorly equipped for night operations. Anti-aircraft batteries in Tokyo were optimized for high-altitude defense. Few guns could depress low enough to engage bombers at 5,000 feet. Technical Sergeant Robert Caron, central fire control gunner aboard the B-29 Straight Flush, recorded his reaction when the mission was briefed on March 8th. "The aircraft commander told us we'd be attacking at night, from low altitude, with most of our guns removed," he wrote in his personal diary. Half the crew thought it was suicide. The other half thought LeMay had lost his mind. But then the intelligence officer showed us the radar images of other cars, Tokyo. Even I could recognize the distinctive shape, the bay, the rivers, the dense urban returns. He said we could bomb Tokyo in pitch darkness with zero visibility and still hit the target area accurately. It seemed impossible, but then everything about this war in the Pacific seemed impossible until we actually did it. At 6 p.m. on March 9, 1945, the first B-29 seconds began lifting off from runways on Guam, Tinian, and Saipan. The mission called for 334 aircraft, the largest formation XXI Bomber Command had ever launched. Each bomber carried approximately 7 tons of incendiaries, a mix of M47 phosphorus bombs and M69 napalm clusters. The M69s were particularly devastating, each cluster containing 38 individual bomblets that would punch through roof tiles, delay for several seconds, then explode and spray napalm in a jet of flame that burned at over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The bomb load represented a carefully calculated formula designed to create a firestorm, enough incendiaries spread across a large enough area to generate fires that would merge and create their own weather, a thermal column drawing in oxygen from all directions to feed flames that would become self-sustaining. The flight north covered 1,500 miles, taking approximately 6 hours. Navigation was by Norden, the long-range navigation system that used precisely timed radio pulses from ground stations to establish positions accurate to within a few miles. As the bomber stream approached Japan, radar operators powered up their APQ-13 systems and began scanning for the Japanese coastline. Sergeant William Taylor, radar operator aboard the B-29 City of Los Angeles, described the approach in a post-mission report. At about 30 miles from the coast, I got my first clear returns. The Boso Peninsula showed up exactly as the training photographs indicated, a distinctive hooked shape extending into the Pacific. I tracked north along the coast and picked up Tokyo Bay, unmistakable on the scope, a large, dark area with Tokyo's urban mass showing bright along its western shore. The Sumida River was harder to spot initially, but as we got closer, I could see it as a dark line cutting through the bright returns of the city center. Everything matched the briefing. We were going to bomb a city I'd never seen with my own eyes, guided entirely by green shapes on my radar scope, and I knew exactly where we were. The Pathfinder aircraft arrived over Tokyo just after midnight on March 10th. Flying at 7,000 feet through light-scattered clouds, they had limited visual reference, mostly just the glow of city lights below, dimmed but not extinguished by blackout regulations. What they could see perfectly was their radar scopes, showing Tokyo's geography in high-contrast phosphorescent detail. The lead radar operators identified the aiming point where the Sumida River curved through the commercial district, a distinctive radar signature that appeared as a dark curved line interrupting the bright urban returns. On command, the Pathfinders released their M47 napalm bombs, creating a flaming X pattern across the target area, fires visible even through the scattered clouds, a beacon for the following bombers. The main force began arriving 10 minutes later. Flying individually, each aircraft approached the target area from slightly different headings, their radar operators calling out returns, their navigators calculating ground speed and wind drift, their bombardiers computing release points based on timing rather than visual acquisition. Every 30 seconds, another B-29 opened its bomb bay doors and released 7 tons of incendiaries onto a city that was already beginning to burn. First Lieutenant Charles Phillips, bombardier aboard Dragon Lady, recorded the bombing run in clinical detail. My radar operator called out the bay at 20 miles, confirmed the coastline at 12 miles, identified the river at 8 miles. The navigator gave me ground speed of 210 miles per hour, wind from the northwest at 18 miles per hour. I set up the Norden for a timing release, though I wasn't using the optics at all, just the mechanical intervalometer. At the computed release point, I hit the salvo switch and felt the aircraft jump as 7 tons of incendiaries dropped away. I never saw Tokyo except as returns on a radar scope. I never saw what we hit except as fire glow below the clouds. Radar bombing meant we were disconnected from the reality of what we were doing. We saw geometry and timing, not a city, not people, not the consequences of our actions. It was easier that way, and infinitely more terrible. By 1 am, the fires below had merged into a conflagration visible from 100 miles away. B-29 crews approaching the target could see the orange glow reflecting off clouds long before their radar picked up Tokyo's coastline. The thermal column generated by the fires created turbulence that threw aircraft around violently, updrafts exceeding 3,000 feet per minute that caught some bombers and threw them thousands of feet higher, despite their pilots' efforts to maintain altitude. Captain Edward Feathers, aircraft commander of 3 Feathers, filed a report describing conditions over the target area. The fires below were so intense that we could feel the heat inside the aircraft even at 7,000 feet. The turbulence was worse than any weather I'd experienced. My radar operator said his scope was almost useless because the heat from the fires was creating electromagnetic interference, causing false returns and snow across his display. But it didn't matter anymore because we could see the target visually, not the individual buildings or streets, just an ocean of fire stretching for miles in every direction. We bombed on the fires themselves, adding our incendiaries to a conflagration that already looked like the end of the world. On the ground, Tokyo's civil defense system collapsed completely within the first hour. Fire departments responding to the initial blazes found themselves surrounded by new fires, starting faster than they could be contained. The incendiary's design, small bomblets that punched through roofs before igniting, meant fires started inside buildings, spreading through interiors before firefighters could even reach the structures. The wind generated by the thermal column, drawing air inward from all directions to feed the flames, reached speeds estimated at 40 to 50 miles per hour, creating a phenomenon survivors would describe as a fire typhoon. People attempting to flee found themselves blown back toward the flames by winds that exceeded their ability to run against them. The firestorm, though meteorologists would debate later whether it technically qualified as a true firestorm, created its own microclimate. The thermal column lifted burning debris thousands of feet into the air, where winds carried it to start new fires miles from the original target area. Temperatures on the ground exceeded 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit in the fire's center. People seeking shelter in canals and rivers found the water heated to scalding temperatures. Those who weren't burned were asphyxiated as the fires consumed oxygen faster than air could rush in to replace it. Police records compiled after the war documented the scale of destruction with bureaucratic precision. 267,000 buildings destroyed, representing approximately 1/4 of Tokyo's total building inventory. 15.8 square miles of urban area burned to bare ground. Official casualty figures listed 83,000 confirmed dead, though later analysis suggested the true number exceeded 100,000. Over 1 million people were left homeless. The single night's attack caused more casualties than either the later atomic bombing of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It was the most destructive air raid in human history, and it had been accomplished almost entirely through radar-guided bombing by crews who never saw their target with their own eyes. The strategic implications rippled through American military planning immediately. LeMay had demonstrated that weather was no longer a limiting factor for strategic bombing. The clouds that covered Japan 80% of the time, the jet stream winds that had made high-altitude precision bombing impossible, none of it mattered anymore when radar could guide bombers through any weather-to-area targets large enough for the APQ-13's resolution to identify. Within a week, LeMay was planning similar raids against Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. The pattern would repeat, radar-guided night attacks at low altitude using incendiaries against urban areas. The destruction would be systematic and overwhelming. Over the next 5 months, XXI Bomber Command would burn 64 Japanese cities, destroying approximately 40% of their built-up areas, all guided primarily by radar when visual conditions prevented using the Norden bombsight. Technical Sergeant Joseph Hudson, radar operator with the 6th Bomb Group, reflected on the evolution of radar bombing in a letter written in April 1945. 6 months ago, we thought radar was just a navigation aid, something to help us find Japan in bad weather. Now it's become our primary bombing tool. We've bombed more missions by radar than we have visually. The funny thing is, we're getting better at it. Our radar operators have learned to read the scopes, like maps. They can identify Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, any of the major cities, just from the radar returns. They know which rivers are which bays have what shape, which urban areas are most dense. We've become specialists in bombing cities we've never seen, guided by technology that didn't even exist when the war started. Sometimes I wonder what this means for the future. If radar can guide bombers through clouds today, what will it be able to do tomorrow? The technology itself wasn't static. By May 1945, a new radar system was entering service with the 315th Bombardment Wing, the AN/APQ-7, codenamed Eagle, where the APQ-13 operated at 10 cm wavelength, the Eagle operated at 3 cm, providing nearly 3 times better resolution. The system used a revolutionary antenna design, a linear array of dipole elements arranged in a wing shape that provided a much narrower beam width and sharper images. Most critically, the Eagle was designed from the beginning as a bombing radar, not a navigation radar adapted for bombing. Its display could be synchronized with the Norden bombsight through an adapter assembly called Nosmo, allowing the bombardier to make fine corrections based on radar returns right up to the moment of bomb release. The 315th Wing's mission profile exploited the Eagle's capabilities ruthlessly. They flew night precision attacks against Japan's oil industry, refineries located along coastlines where radar could clearly distinguish the industrial facilities from surrounding areas. The first mission, against the Utsube oil refinery at Yokkaichi on the night of June 26, 1945, achieved results that would have seemed impossible with the older APQ-13. 30 bombers attacked the refinery and destroyed or damaged 30% of the facility, despite total darkness and cloud cover. Post-strike reconnaissance showed bombs concentrated within the refinery boundaries, with an accuracy that approached daylight visual bombing results. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Eagle radar represented the apex of World War II-era radar bombing technology, but it arrived too late to see extensive combat use. Only the 315th Wing was fully equipped with the system, flying missions for approximately 6 weeks before Japan surrendered in August 1945. Still, those 6 weeks demonstrated what radar bombing could achieve with sufficient resolution and proper integration with optical bomb sights. The Wing flew 15 missions against oil refineries and storage facilities, destroying most of Japan's remaining petroleum infrastructure using radar for 95% of their bombing. The cumulative effect of radar-guided strategic bombing on Japan was devastating in ways that went beyond simple physical destruction. The ability to bomb through any weather meant Japanese cities had no sanctuary from air attack. Previous bombing campaigns could be predicted, at least partially, by weather patterns. When visibility was poor, bombers wouldn't come. Radar eliminated that predictability. American B-29 seconds could now attack in any weather, day or night, through any cloud cover, guided technology that Japanese air defenses couldn't counter. The psychological impact on Japanese civilian morale was profound. Major Akiro Takahashi, an officer in Tokyo's civil defense organization, wrote in a report filed in June 1945 that was later captured by American occupation forces. The enemy's ability to bomb accurately in all weather conditions has destroyed public confidence in air raid shelters and evacuation procedures. Citizens now understand that cloud cover provides no protection. Darkness provides no protection. The American bombers come regardless of conditions, guided by some technology we cannot observe or defeat. Our radar stations detect their approach, but we cannot jam or disrupt whatever system guides their bombing. The fires start with precision, even when visibility is zero. The impact on industrial production was equally crippling, though not in the way American precision bombing doctrine had originally envisioned. Rather than destroying specific factories with pinpoint accuracy, radar-guided area bombing destroyed the urban infrastructure that supported industry. Workers who lost their homes could not report to factories. Transportation networks burned in the firebombing campaigns could not deliver raw materials or finished goods. The dispersed small workshop production system that had made Japanese industry resistant to precision attacks became its vulnerability when entire urban districts were burned out by radar-guided incendiary raids. Statistical analysis conducted after the war by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey attempted to quantify radar bombing's contribution to Japan's defeat. The numbers were stark. From January through August 1945, XXI Bomber Command flew 33,000 sorties against Japanese targets. Approximately 60% of those sorties, 19,800 missions, bombed using radar as the primary or sole guidance method. Weather conditions prevented visual bombing on the remaining 40% of missions, meaning radar-guided attacks represented the majority of effective strikes against Japan during the critical final months of the war. The tonnage of bombs delivered by radar guidance totaled approximately 157,000 tons, representing 58% of the total bomb tonnage dropped on the Japanese home islands by B-29 seconds. The physical destruction attributable to radar-guided attacks included 15.8 square miles of Tokyo, 3.8 square miles of Nagoya, 2.9 square miles of Osaka, and significant portions of 60 other Japanese cities. Total casualties from the radar-guided bombing campaign, including both the precision attacks and the area incendiary raids, were estimated at between 220,000 and 500,000 killed, with 5 million made homeless. These figures made radar-guided strategic bombing the single most destructive element of the Pacific War, in terms of Japanese civilian casualties and urban destruction, exceeding even the atomic bombings in aggregate effect. But statistics obscure the human reality experienced by the men who operated the radar systems. They were, on average, 23 years old, most with only a few months of radar training before being assigned to combat crews. They sat in darkened stations aboard aircraft flying through the night, watching phosphorescent images paint across cathode ray tubes, calling out returns that would guide tons of incendiaries onto cities full of people they would never see. The psychological disconnect was profound and necessary. Sergeant Robert Schultz, radar operator with the 56th Squadron, attempted to articulate this disconnection in a journal entry written in July 1945. When I look at my scope, I see geometric shapes, bright returns, dark areas, coastlines, rivers, urban masses. I don't see people. I can't see people on a radar scope. The technology interposes this layer of abstraction between my actions and their consequences. I know intellectually that when I identify a target return and call out the bombing coordinates, I am guiding weapons that will kill human beings. But emotionally, psychologically, I'm just reading a radar display and translating electronic echoes into navigation data. It's like a video game, except the game is real and the consequences are measured in human lives I will never see or know. I don't know if this makes me a coward or just a product of technological warfare. Maybe there's no difference. The radar operators weren't the only ones grappling with this psychological burden. Navigators who translated radar data into bombing solutions, bombardiers who pushed the release buttons based on timing rather than visual acquisition, pilots who flew the bomb runs guided by instruments rather than their eyes. All of them existed in this strange liminal space where technology mediated between action and consequence. The traditional image of bomber crews visually acquiring targets, seeing what they were attacking, making moment-to-moment decisions based on what their eyes showed them, of that image belonged to an earlier era of warfare. Radar bombing represented something new, warfare conducted through electronic intermediaries, where human decisions were executed by technology that transformed targets into abstract representations on screens. The B-29 crews flying radar-guided missions were pioneers in this new form of combat, though most of them would not have described themselves that way. They were simply using the tools they'd been given to accomplish the mission they'd been assigned. The fact that those tools fundamentally changed the nature of strategic bombing, making weather irrelevant and enabling area attacks of unprecedented scale, was something they understood intellectually but rarely discussed among themselves. There was a job to do, and radar made it possible, and to do that job regardless of conditions. The philosophical implications could wait for peacetime. The Japanese response to American radar bombing evolved from confusion to desperation, but never reached effectiveness. Japanese air defense forces could detect approaching B-29 formations using their own radar systems, long-range search radars that provided early warning of raids crossing the Pacific. What they lacked was any ability to jam or disrupt the American bombing radars. The APQ-13 and APQ-7 operated at frequencies and power levels that Japanese electronic warfare technology could barely detect, much less counter. Even if they had been able to jam the radars, the Americans could fall back on alternative navigation systems like LORAN, or in the case of the firebombing raids, simply bomb the visible fires themselves. Major General Torashiro Kawabe, Deputy Chief of the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff, wrote in his diary after the war that American technological superiority in radar had been decisive. "We knew the American bombers were using radar to guide their attacks," he recorded. "Our intelligence officers captured references to radar equipment from shot-down B-29 seconds, but we had no countermeasures. Our radar technology was years behind American capabilities. We could detect their aircraft approaching. We could not prevent them from bombing accurately once they arrived. The combination of radar guidance and incendiary weapons proved unstoppable. Our cities burned regardless of weather or darkness because American technology had made both irrelevant. The strategic lessons learned from radar bombing against Japan would shape military aviation for decades after World War II ended. The principle that weather should not limit air operations became a fundamental requirement for all subsequent bombing systems. The Cold War-era development of all-weather strike aircraft, radar-guided missiles, and eventually precision-guided munitions all traced their conceptual origins to the radar bombing campaign against Japan in 1945. The technology itself evolved rapidly in the post-war period. The APQ-13 and Eagle systems that had guided B-29 seconds through clouds over Japan were obsolete within 5 years, replaced by higher-resolution radars operating at millimeter wavelengths, offering detail approaching optical imagery. By the Vietnam War, radar bombing had evolved into terrain-following systems that allowed aircraft to fly at treetop level in complete darkness, hugging ground contours to avoid detection. The Gulf War in 1991 showcased synthetic aperture radar that could produce photographic-quality images through clouds and darkness, guiding precision weapons to within meters of their intended targets. But the fundamental principle remained unchanged from that February night in 1945, when B-29 crews first proved they could bomb Tokyo through solid cloud cover using nothing but electronic echoes on a cathode ray tube. Weather had ceased to be a limiting factor for air power. The sky was no longer a sanctuary on cloudy days. Radar had made bombing an all-weather, day and night capability, and that change was permanent and irreversible. For the men who had operated those first combat radar systems, the experience remained vivid decades later. In 1978, a reunion of XXI Bomber Command veterans included a panel discussion on radar bombing operations. Technical Sergeant William Morrison, now a retired electronics engineer, spoke about his experience as a radar operator during the campaign. "People ask me if I felt guilty about bombing cities I couldn't see," he told the assembled veterans. "The honest answer is complicated. At the time, in 1945, I was 22 years old, doing what I'd been trained to do, operating equipment that let us continue the mission when visual bombing was impossible. I was proud of my technical skill. I could read that radar scope better than most operators. I knew Tokyo's radar signature like I knew my hometown streets. Whether what we did was right or wrong, that's a question I'll leave to historians and philosophers. What I know is that radar made it possible to bomb through any weather, and we used that capability to destroy Japanese cities on a scale that helped end the war. The technology was neutral. How we used it, that's where the moral questions lie." The final accounting of radar bombing's effectiveness came from an unexpected source. After Japan's surrender, American occupation forces interviewed Japanese military and civilian officials to assess what factors had contributed most significantly to Japan's decision to capitulate. General Kawabe's responses, recorded in September 1945, placed radar-guided strategic bombing near the top of the list. The systematic destruction of our cities by American bombers that could attack regardless of weather conditions destroyed both our industrial capacity and civilian morale, he stated. We had hoped that Japan's climate, with its frequent clouds and storms, would provide some protection from strategic bombing. When American radar technology eliminated that protection, making our cities vulnerable to attack in any conditions, the strategic situation became hopeless. The firebombing campaign guided by radar proved as devastating as our worst-case assessments had predicted. We could not defend against it effectively, and we could not endure it indefinitely. The irony was not lost on American planners who had spent the first year of the B-29 campaign struggling with weather limitations. The technology that saved the strategic bombing campaign, the AN/APQ-13 radar system that crews had initially viewed as just a navigation aid, had become the decisive weapon that made precision doctrine irrelevant and area bombing unavoidable. What began as an attempt to see through clouds ended as a method for destroying entire cities. The transformation happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, as tactical necessity drove doctrinal evolution, but the result was unmistakable. By August 1945, American strategic bombing had become fundamentally dependent on radar guidance. The Norden bombsight, that mechanical marvel that had cost billions to develop and deploy, had been relegated to secondary status, useful only on the rare clear days when visual bombing was possible. The primitive radar scopes, with their green phosphorescent displays and 3-degree beam widths, had become the primary bombing instruments for the most powerful air force in the world. Technical Sergeant Robert Chen, whose experience over Tokyo in February 45 had introduced this story, flew his final combat mission on August 14, 1945. The target was the Nippon Oil Refinery at Tsuchizaki. Weather was predicted as cloudy with low visibility. The mission was planned as a radar attack from the beginning. Chen's scope showed the coastline clearly, the refinery's distinctive location on a peninsula jutting into the sea, unmistakable on the display. The bombing was accurate. The refinery was destroyed. 6 hours after Chen's aircraft landed at Saipan, Japan announced its unconditional surrender. In his final mission log entry, Chen wrote a reflection that captured the strange nature of radar warfare. Today we destroyed our last target, guided entirely by radar through complete cloud cover. In the last 7 months, I have bombed Japan over 40 times. I have seen Japanese cities with my own eyes, perhaps 6 times. The rest were just glowing returns on my scope, abstract shapes that I learned to recognize and name, but never actually witnessed. I guided tons of bombs onto targets I knew only as electronic echoes. This was my war, fought through a cathode ray tube, conducted in an electromagnetic spectrum invisible to human eyes, prosecuted with a precision that depended on mathematics and radio waves, rather than vision and judgment. It was war abstracted through technology, and it was terrifyingly effective. Now it's over. I can go home. But I will never forget those glowing returns on my scope, those cities I destroyed without ever seeing them. Radar showed me where they were. It could not show me what they were, or who lived there, or what it meant to burn them from the sky. That knowledge came later and stays with me still. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.